Biomutant is one of the weirdest video games I've ever played. You play as a furry creature who must decide the fate of the world, but you also pee on fast travel points. You ride around on a mechanical hand. You collect monster poop. You dress in clothes made for children, and the whole game is narrated by a British man who talks like Dr. Seuss.
Look, an emergency box from the once was. A rare sight.
It's eccentric, it's quirky, and a bit cheesy. But for the most part, it comes together to form a unique experience that I won't soon forget. I can honestly say I've never played a game quite like Biomutant. Even after beating the game, I have a hard time giving an elevator pitch description in this review. It's an RPG because you do things like create a character. It has a karma system that keeps track of your choices. It has tons of looting, crafting, skill points, and upgrades. It lets you make big decisions which have impacts on the world and the ending. While it does all of these things, I found myself enjoying the world and the combat most of all. Despite having its fair share of checklist activities, you get to do all of it in one of the most visually stunning worlds I've ever seen. I mean, seriously, there are times in this game where I think, is this the best looking game I've ever played? And the flashy combat is stuffed with variety and depth to the point that I struggled to put the game down. But in order to like any of this, I think you really have to buy into what Biomutant is selling, because at times it can feel incredibly charming and refreshing, but it can also be cheesy and a bit irritating. Before we dive in, big thanks to THQ Nordic for the review code. If you're looking to buy the game and want to know about bugs and technical issues, I played Biomutant on PC with a 1080 Ti. On max settings, this ran relatively smooth at 60 FPS 1080p. I noticed some drop frames when entering conversations and sometimes when combat gets pretty intense, but it didn't happen enough to bother me. In terms of bugs, I had a few minor ones, like one fast travel point didn't activate, and a couple of resource totems didn't give me materials. But I just reloaded my save and the problem fixed itself. And I'm a stickler for technical issues. Like if a game has problems, it bothers me, and these issues did not affect my enjoyment. Overall, I found it to be a technically sound product on launch, so I don't think you need to worry about that. There's a lot going on with this game's story. You're given 3 main objectives after the lengthy exposition, and all of them must be resolved by the end. They are interconnected and cross paths, and while some are more interesting than others, I do think there's plenty to enjoy here. There's a general sense of quirkiness about the world that is undeniably charming. You play as a creature in a post-apocalypse where humanity destroyed the world with pollution. The personal story here involves your mutant's family and dealing with the past. I won't get too far into this because of spoilers, but I will tell you it's told through a series of flashbacks where you go back and relive your memories. This part of the narrative didn't really grab me, but it felt like a nice breather from the open world stuff. The rest of the story, however, is far more interesting. 4 giant creatures called World Eaters are destroying the Tree of Life, and it's your job to either stop them so the world can go on, or let them destroy it so the world ends and can start over. This involves going to the 4 corners of the map and doing a series of missions to unlock a machine that lets you fight a specific World Eater. It's very Breath of the Wild in that way. New biomes, new machines, new giant boss. Unfortunately, it felt a bit formulaic to me after the second one because you end up doing a very similar set of objectives in pretty much the same order. That was a bit of a bummer, but I will say the novelty of each machine keeps things really interesting. You get to pilot a mech, you get to drive around a jet ski, and you get to use a submarine. And once I got to the World Eaters, I was always impressed. I mean, they are massive, incredibly creative creatures that surprised me with the quality of the animation and the scale of the encounter. While the World Eaters are fairly straightforward, the tribal war is anything but. And that's what makes it super compelling. The land is divided between 6 tribes who each have very different ideas about how to solve the end of the world. As the protagonist, you get to choose one tribe to side with and then work with their Sifu to achieve those goals. This was the most intriguing part for me because there's so much variation here. You can go with a good karma tribe like the Myriad, who believe in a greater good, seeking to unite all of the tribes to defeat the World Eaters. Or you can go with an evil tribe like the Lotus, who seek absolute order at any cost necessary, seeking to kill the tribes and let the World Eaters eat the world. But those are the extremes because you have a lot of nuance with these other tribes. The Ankati believe in solidarity and that everyone should unite towards a common goal. The Jagni want to be feared more than anything else. The Netra value freedom among the tribes to make whatever choices each of them wants to make, and they actually want to disband the tribes entirely. And the Pichu want nature to run its course, which is basically like natural selection. It makes for an impressive mix of ideals with perspectives that I don't think you see most games dealing with. In this way, it kind of feels like Fallout New Vegas. You're coming towards a conclusion and you have a lot of options with how you want to deal with it. What was really cool to me is that your choices are reflected in what you're actually doing moment to moment to resolve the war. If you're working to unite the tribes, some of them will not surrender, and it initiates these massive assaults where you conquer their fort. Others, however, can be persuaded, and you can avoid fighting entirely. Once you defeat a tribe, you can ask them to join your own, or you can lock them up. This was my experience because I chose the maximum light myriad tribe path, who always encouraged me to unite, but they ultimately left the decision up to me. But I could have gone down an entirely different path. I mean, your primary goal could be to kill all of the tribes. I'm really not sure what happens if you let the World Eaters destroy the Tree of Life, but there's a lot going on here. It was pretty clear to me after one playthrough that Biomutant has some serious replay potential. Luckily, there's a New Game Plus mode right out of the box, so if you choose one path, you can go back through and choose something completely different the second time to see what happens, but with all of your gear and your character progression. Speaking of, if you're looking for how long this game is, I was able to finish it in 14 hours by mostly sticking to the main content. I think I'm definitely on the quicker side of things, but it's also possible to just rush through and finish this game in about 10 hours. But don't worry, if that number is shocking to you, there's a ton of side content. I mean, a ton. And if I had to give a ballpark estimate, you could probably spend 3 times as much time as I did playing through this game and not do everything. Before we move on, I do want to mention the karma system. At the start, you can choose your aura, going with light or dark. This doesn't lock you down because I chose dark in the beginning thinking I would do an evil playthrough, and of course I ended up making decisions that turned me into, a light path in the end. But the game contextualizes these decisions through these creatures who appear. It's kind of like the angel and the devil on your shoulders, and they comment on your choices. If you make a light choice, the angel figure will tease the devil figure, and vice versa. This happens during major story beats, but the game also gives you smaller opportunities to make decisions like choosing to save an animal or lock it up. For the most part, these felt a little childish to me, but it does fit the overall tone of the game, which we're about to get into. I don't know how much people will focus on this in reviews, but it affected me, so I'm dedicating an entire section to it because you might run into a wall with this game. Biomutant's story is narrated pretty much nonstop. That means you'll hear David Parker Shaw narrating during general cutscenes. You'll hear him translating for the game's creatures who speak gibberish, and he'll do a play-by-play as you roam around the world.
Keep focused on what you can do today. Tomorrow's already gone.
Now, you can turn off the open world chatter through a menu slider, which is kind of funny. It's like Experiment 101 knew people wouldn't like this, but you can't turn off the narration for the other 2 parts. You can't even turn off the translation and just read the text. Needless to say, after a certain point, David Parker Shaw just wore me down. And it's not that he doesn't have a nice voice. It's nice to listen to. I mean, he does. It's what he says and how much he's talking. It feels like his lines were ripped off from one of those happy quote calendars you can buy off Amazon, or the cheesy Facebook quotes that boomers like your parents post every single day. About halfway through my time on the game, I started skipping dialogue entirely. What was supposed to feel charming and witty just became irritating. The thing is, most NPCs in this game have some sort of philosophical spiel about life. They say things like, "You gotta keep going, son. Don't worry about the choices you made. What matters is that you made them and you're here now." This is no exaggeration. It's really that corny, and I think I heard a different version of that same line like 30 times. I mean, it got to a point where I could predict exactly what was going to be said. And again, all of this is narrated by David Parker Shaw. I guess it's not his fault. None of this is, but I think the writing on this game was either too focused on a single set of ideas or just too limited in scope. The only times these talking points were different was with the tribal war, which makes sense because they all believe something different. But everyone else has the exact same thing to say, which means none of them really stood out to me, and choosing dialogue options doesn't really matter because you're going to hear the same thing over and over again. There's not a single one character that I think I'll remember from this game, and that kind of sucks to me. I mean, you've got furry talking animals. There was a lot of potential for a memorable personality here, and there just isn't one. Because of the repetition and the narration, dialogue takes way too long to sit through. Here's how it plays out. You pick a dialogue option, then you hear a creature speak gibberish for a few seconds, and then you see the subtitles pop up, and then you hear David Parker Shaw.
Says you should enjoy the day. Happy you know Goop. He put the goo glide on the surf, you know.
I just think the whole narration translation loop really drags down the presentation of the story. And it doesn't really help that they went for a looser animation style. I mean, these aren't cutscenes that you really need to watch, I would say. All of this translated to me skipping cutscenes after a certain point and picking dialogue options that got me through quickest. Now that was a lot of negative feedback, but I will say I can sort of respect Experiment 101 for sticking to their guns here. They wanted their game to have a narrator, and that's fine. But if I had a no narration option, I would have turned on that baby from the start. I would have been more than happy to listen to the gibberish of the animals and just read the subtitles. Clearly, for me, this is something that stuck out like a sore thumb, so I'm interested to see how others feel about it. Before we move on, I also feel like I need to comment on the tone. This game felt a bit too preachy to me, and I think it undermines what it's trying to say. Because instead of making any sort of meaningful commentary about, say the environment and what's going on in our world with global warming, I was distracted by the cheesy lines about how I can only choose to let go of the past and forge my own destiny. I'm sure this will work for some people, but yeah, it just didn't work for me. All right, I'm glad we're done talking about narration because, man, Biomutant is just gorgeous, isn't it? I think it's one of the most vibrant post-apocalyptic games out there. The setting is fantastic for exploration because it creates interesting areas like the Dead Zone, which require oxygen to navigate. You get to use this awesome mech suit to protect yourself, and it's just fun to suck up black goo, and it has its own ranged and melee attacks. And this contrasts heavily with the rolling green hills of the center of the map. Biomutant has 7 different biomes, and they all feel unique. 7, and they're absurdly beautiful. One of them is filled with water, so you get to ride around on your goo glider. Another one feels like you just walked into the Grand Canyon. I was just floored by how these look, but also how the day-night cycle and dynamic weather affected them. For example, rain in the desert region feels much different than a clear day. Outside of biomes and the dead zone, there's heat, cold, biohazard, and radiation zones which require a suit or a resistance to explore. There's just so much variety, and visually, every single one of these areas looks amazing. It's one of few games where I'm willing to just mount up and ride around and soak it all in. And what helps that feeling even more is the incredible soundtrack. You've been hearing it in the background so far, but I can't fail to mention how great the music is. I normally don't even notice music enough to comment on it, but man, the sound design and the original tracks do so much for this world and how the game feels to play. Most of the game's exploration has you diving into cavernous ruins and rifling through abandoned towns for weapon parts. You're literally picking up the pieces of humanity, and like most post-apocalyptic games, it's fun to see what used to be. After a certain point though, searching for loot got tedious for me. Most of what you find are healing items, and on normal difficulty, I think I died maybe twice. Luckily, there are some short puzzles to mix things up, and every time you find one, you'll find an old piece of technology. At first, I didn't like these because of how simple they are, but I don't know, they kind of grew on me. And what helps with this experience is that Biomutant borrows the rhythm and the alliteration of Dr. Seuss for its language. This is where Sir David Parker Shaw truly shines, because it's fun to hear him explain how a clothes soaker machine works. If you've played a lot of open world games, these activities will feel familiar. Go to this location, find the item. Go to this place, grab the upgrade point. And there are so many small things to do in what I would consider a pretty big world. At a certain point, you'll have what feels like a million blue dots marking side quests and activities all over your map. It falls into that rhythm, and like most games in the genre, these are only fun if the gameplay around it and supporting it is solid and the locations are interesting and feel handcrafted. And luckily, I think Biomutant checks both of those boxes. Now, if you're looking to get particularly immersed, you might run into an issue because each time you enter a new area, you'll get a checklist in the bottom corner telling you exactly what is there. This is something that doesn't bother everyone, but if you appreciate a less guided, more organic exploration experience, this might bother you and you can't turn it off. Now, there are more story-driven activities that feel less formulaic. For example, this guy Gulp likes to drink, so he asked me to find him some radium syrup. I went to a nearby location, grabbed the syrup, and then I returned back. And then we had a drinking challenge for fun. There's another character who offered to upgrade one of my tools. They sent me to a power plant where I fought off some enemies and then used electricity, to power up my power fist. Missions like these have more nuanced quest design with context instead of just hunting down items from a list. There's plenty of these, but in my perfect world, there was a lot more of these story-driven, activities than the checklist ones. In terms of moving around the world, Biomutant gives you plenty of unique options. Of course, there's fast travel with tons of points, and it takes just a second to load on PC, so it's nice and easy. On foot, you actually move pretty quickly, but you can upgrade your agility to the point that you're almost as fast as when using a mount. With another upgrade, you're able to jump off of cliffs and glide around with a glider, which really shows off the scale of this world. You have a range of mounts that you can tame, but also some really interesting ones that you get from the story, like this mechanical horse. By far, the coolest mount I found is this mechanical hand. It's a bit slower, but you can transform it into a firing mode and shoot missiles from the finger. It's something that's just insane on its own, but it fits perfectly in this universe. I was disappointed, however, that I couldn't use the mech, goo glider, or the submarine outside of specific areas. Like, there's a lot of water around the map, but when I went up to it and tried to spawn my goo glider, I couldn't, and that kind of sucked. I think exploration in this game is sold by the weird and wonderful quality that it gives off. I mean, there's so many jaw-dropping qualities about what Experiment 101 crafted here, and it's definitely one of the most fun aspects of this game to me. It's time we talked about combat, because this is my other favorite part of Biomutant. This game puts a premium on being awesome to look at and giving you lots of different tools to mix and match. And yeah, when it all comes together, it looks absolutely amazing and it'll make you feel like a badass. I'm not a fan of games that give you a ton of options because I only end up liking one or two of them and the rest just end up sucking. I never ran into that problem with Biomutant. There's 5 to 6 melee types and 5 to 6 range types. These are things you'd expect, like dual swords and big hammers, or rifles and shotguns. But then you have these completely unique tools that are tied to the story that can also be used as weapons. The Power Fist has this completely unique behavior which lets you charge it up for a flaming punch. The Netra Tribe weapon, which does minimal damage, can yank enemies up off the ground for air combos. There are so many other examples, but every time I came across one of these, I had that aha moment where I was just surprised and impressed by how cool all of this is. There's some creative way to blend weapons together in this combat system. It just all works. Mechanically, Biomutant rewards you for always moving and chaining together attacks. Your mutant comes from a line of skilled fighters who know how to Wung Fu, which is kind of like this Gung Fu martial arts style. Each weapon type, melee and ranged, has a set of basic moves and a set of special attacks which you can unlock with upgrade points. So you can focus on just melee or just ranged, but I really appreciated how most of the combos in this game incorporate both together. It forced me to close the gap in situations where I might have just sat back and fired my gun. But then you also have this wrinkle in the form of mutations and psi attacks, which really mix things up. You can teleport forward to close the gap. You can summon ice spikes, which make your enemies slip and slide on the ground. At higher levels, you can levitate, which I started to combo with this ground smash attack. The beauty of this combat is when everything flows and you're chaining from combo to combo while avoiding damage. It's also in the slick and stylish direction they took with the animation, with these bursting comic book effects, with text that appears when you pull off a special attack. However, I do have one issue with the combat, and for me, it's the way that enemies are designed. Biomutant has a parry system, but the problem is it's really difficult to pull off in any predictable way. It's a combination of enemies just not popping enough from the background and the animation just not giving you proper cues. They don't give you time to react. You know how enemies are supposed to telegraph and give you a huge wind up before they hit you? Biomutant does do that, but in my opinion, it's just way too quick. As someone who normally has no problem learning parry timing, I could not get any kind of rhythm down with this game. So, every now and again, you'll run into fights where you just fail to hit a rhythm state. But I want to stress this isn't game breaking or anything like that. If you can pull off 3 special attacks in a single fight, you get to enter this super Wung Fu state where you deal a ton of damage. This resets after each fight. So again, it creates another rhythm. You're always looking for ways to build combos in order to go into Wung Fu. Biomutant's nature of being flexible extends to the RPG class system. At the beginning, you get to pick a class and a genetic code, which determines your stats. Because I picked a Deadeye, I have 6 unique unlocks, unique skills, which aren't like moves you can do, they're more just passive bonuses. But after the time I played in the game, that's really the only difference I've noticed that matters. Everything else can be fully explored by every class, so I don't think you really need to worry too much about your decision. Like most RPGs, there's experience and leveling, and Biomutant has great pacing here. Everything I was doing, killing, exploring, or focusing on the story was progressing me further. Each time you level up, you get to add 10 points to an attribute. So you've got the classic ones: vitality, strength, intellect, agility, charisma, and luck. These are very clearly defined, and unlike a lot of RPGs, I felt like I could actually feel the difference immediately. For example, if you bump up your agility, you'll move quicker, like it's very noticeable. Now, completely separate from leveling up is the mutations and psi abilities. You unlock new powers by finding specific locations in the world, so in order to learn this ice ability, for example, I had to find enough shrines in order to unlock it. Like I said earlier, I did some exploration, but I mostly focused on the story. I had no problem finding shrines, but the biopods are a bit harder to find. So it feels like that did limit how many mutations I had by the end. But personally, I like this kind of progression that forces me to go out and find stuff. So this is not a criticism, but just know that you might have to explore a decent amount to unlock every single thing that you can do. One part of Biomutant that I think most people will love is the crafting. You can create some crazy looking weapons that are so bizarre they could only belong to this universe. And there's a hefty amount of complexity. It offers a ton of depth if you're really looking for it. You'll find weapon parts in containers when you're looting, so things like handles, stocks, blades, scopes. These can be jammed onto weapons that you already have, or you can use them to create entirely new ones. But in order to make new weapons, you have to find a base type. And this determines what kind of weapon you're making, and mostly how good it ends up being. So if you find a shotgun base, for example, you can customize everything else around it that makes kind of smaller changes to the stats. And if you're really lucky, you'll find bases with elemental damage and a specific perk. This hammer of mine does cold damage, and it has this special modifier. Later on, though, I found this electric rifle, and guys, this absolutely obliterated everything for like several hours. The reason it's so strong is that it's a legendary weapon. Every individual part that you find has 2 sort of stats to it. It has a quality meter and a material level. These determine the stats on it and what kind of rarity the item has, going from common all the way up to legendary. But you're not stuck with however you find these, because if you have enough raw materials, you can bump up these levels using an upgrade bench. This goes for weapons and armor. It makes for a flexible, intuitive crafting system that is just a blast to play around with. And one thing I have to tell you guys, if you decide to grab the game, make sure you play around with the randomize feature in the crafting menu. This takes all of your parts and creates a random weapon, and it makes crazy combinations that, yeah, you'd never find out on your own. Simply put, the combination of the combat, the RPG mechanics, and the crafting just put flexibility first, and they present familiar ideas in ways that surprised me and kept my attention throughout the experience. I mean, it's really awesome. Biomutant is like that kid in the cafeteria who sits by himself and he's doing his own thing and he's just having a great time doing it. In a sea of samey open world RPGs, this game is designed to support the fantasy of its own world instead of bending to the genre. It's not overly serious, and it's not trapped by the confines of AAA game design. It charts its own course with an eclectic tone that will either charm you or turn you away. Despite the very real issues that I have with the narrator, I had an absolute blast with Biomutant, and I'd highly recommend this game if you're looking to get lost in a gorgeous open world, or you just want something a little bit different than you're used to. That is all for me today, so I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you did, please let me know by hitting that like button. And if you're new around here, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You can also click that bell to turn on live notifications so you don't miss my next video. You can also follow me on social media, jayveeonYT on Twitter and jayvee.yt on Instagram for updates on all of my content. If you want to chat more about Biomutant or any other games, you can join our community Discord server over at discord.gg/jayveeonYT. Links for everything I've talked about are in the description below. Big thanks to my YouTube members, Ultra fans Bill, Cam, Jacob, Super fans Tipsy Sergey, Tarl K, and William, fans Matthew, Spyro, JVO, Level 42, Bloodsky, Kamal, and Andy, and supporters Nos, Sung, Adam, Mr. Hollow, Quickness, Firkin, Jay, Sam, Abhishek, Ferris, Report, Gabrielle, Abraham, and Reaperman for supporting the channel. If you want to support me further, click the join button below the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.